My mom and stepdad took care of a small cemetery for about 10 years, and all 6 of their kids helped with the work at different times. I had spent enough time there that the cemetery never felt particularly strange to me. It was simply another place where I had chores to do. One summer, I was helping my mom with mowing and general upkeep. That year was especially hot, so we tried to get started early each morning before the temperature became unbearable. One morning, however, the truck gave us trouble, and we couldn't get everything finished. My mom had an appointment the following morning, and rain was expected the day after that, so I volunteered to return early and finish trimming the cemetery with the weed eater. I figured it would be a quick, quiet morning of work. Around 7, I arrived and started moving between the headstones with my headphones on. I was listening to music while working, mostly focused on getting through the remaining areas before the heat became too intense. Everything seemed completely normal until I reached the oldest section of the cemetery. That part was located on a small slope of a hill. From the bottom, the road at the top was hidden from view, although once you climbed about halfway up, you could see it again. After finishing around the last headstone, I turned off the equipment and started walking back up the hill. I was tired and probably wasn't paying much attention to my surroundings at first. Then I glanced upward and saw a little girl in a pretty red dress. She was running across the hill and disappeared behind a large headstone. For a moment, I didn't think anything of it. I assumed her parents were visiting someone buried there and that the girl had wandered away to entertain herself. By then, it was around 9 in the morning, so seeing someone at a cemetery didn't seem impossible. I continued walking toward the top of the hill, expecting to see her or whoever had brought her there. But when I reached the top, there was no car and no one around. The cemetery wasn't close to any houses, and there wasn't an obvious place nearby where a child that young could have come from. The girl had also been dressed far too neatly for me to imagine that she had simply wandered there alone. I looked back toward the headstone and called out for her to come back. I could clearly see the spot where she had disappeared. If she had run around either side of the headstone, I should have seen her. Yet there was absolutely nothing. I called my mom and explained what had happened. I asked whether I should call the police because I was worried there might actually be a 3- or 4-year-old child wandering around alone. My mom listened and then asked me one question. Was the girl wearing a red dress? I said yes and asked why she wanted to know. What she told me next caught me completely off guard. She casually explained that the girl was the cemetery's ghost. That was not information I expected to receive over the phone while standing alone among the graves. Anyone who knows me knows I have never been comfortable with ghosts. I immediately asked my mom why she hadn't told me there was supposedly a ghost in the cemetery before sending me there by myself. She admitted that she needed my help and was afraid I wouldn't come if I knew the place was haunted. I couldn't really blame her for needing help, but I definitely wished I had been given the choice. Looking back, I probably would have been more cautious, but I still would have helped because my mom needed someone. I simply would have made sure I wasn't working there alone. I still visit the cemetery occasionally because I have relatives buried there, but I always make sure someone is with me. Thankfully, I never saw anything else unusual there, and I have never seen that little girl in the red dress again. My dad bought a cemetery when I was in middle school, and I worked there with him all the way through high school graduation. Most of my responsibilities involved yard work, including mowing, trimming weeds, and taking care of the flower beds. Because I spent so much time there, I became familiar with the cemetery's layout and the routines involved in maintaining it. Aside from occasionally seeing shadows out of the corner of my eye, briefly noticing people who turned out not to be there, and hearing strange sounds, the cemetery was actually a peaceful place. Most days were quiet and uneventful, and I never considered every strange little thing to be supernatural. The part that always felt different, though, was dealing with burials in the crypts. To access one, you have to dig down roughly 4 or 5 feet until you reach a set of large concrete doors. Those doors are then pulled away, revealing a small room underneath the ground. A crypt can hold 2 coffins, or it can contain decades' worth of cremated remains. Families in the 1950s and 1960s sometimes purchased a single crypt for their entire family, meaning relatives could be placed inside over many years. Some families simply put the cremated remains inside and sealed the crypt again. Others treated the space almost like a private memorial. They would leave candles, flowers, photographs, and small personal keepsakes behind. Those objects could remain there for decades, untouched and forgotten. Eventually, someone would have to open the crypt again, and that was when the age of everything inside became very obvious. There was something deeply unsettling about opening one of those spaces after 50 years and seeing melted candle wax still sitting there beside old photographs. The pictures were of people who had been gone for decades, and the objects they had left behind had remained in that enclosed room the entire time. Nothing supernatural had to happen for the experience to feel disturbing. The history of the people inside was already sitting right in front of you. The strangest part came when you actually climbed down into the crypt. Once you were inside, you suddenly realized that you were standing at the same level as the remains. The walls surrounded you. The opening above was the only obvious way out, and the people whose remains were stored there had been resting in that tiny room for years. It gave you a strange realization that was difficult to shake. You weren't simply working around graves anymore. You were physically standing inside a room containing generations of someone's family. That feeling stayed with me. Even though I worked around graves for years and was used to the cemetery, those crypts always had a different atmosphere. There was something about opening a place that had remained closed for half a century and seeing those old photographs, melted candles, and personal belongings that made the work feel much more personal than ordinary yard maintenance. It was probably the closest I ever came to feeling uncomfortable there. When I was in college, I worked part-time at a Jewish cemetery, helping with reception and office management. The cemetery closed from Friday afternoon until Saturday evening for the Sabbath, so staff normally had to finish their work before closing time. On some Friday afternoons, however, we stayed a little later to finish things like sending out bills or processing checks. It was routine work, and I had become used to the quiet atmosphere around the office by then. One Friday, while we were still inside, we suddenly heard a loud commotion coming from the direction of the cemetery entrance. The gate was locked, and only staff members were normally allowed to enter or leave after closing. The office manager decided to go see what was happening and told me to come along. We walked down toward the entrance, expecting to find someone who had arrived after closing and needed assistance. When we reached the gate, there was an older woman standing outside. She looked to be around 70 years old and was dressed extremely well, almost as though she had come from an important event. She was clearly distressed and kept begging us to let her inside. The main thing she kept saying was that she needed to get back. The situation was strange even before anything else happened. The cemetery was located in suburban New Jersey, where getting around without a vehicle wasn't easy. Yet there was no car parked nearby, and we couldn't see any obvious reason for the woman to have appeared there on foot. She was simply standing outside the locked entrance in an elegant dress, asking us to let her through. We explained that we couldn't open the gate ourselves and would have to get the cemetery manager. We went back to find him and returned to the entrance with him. But when we got there, the woman was gone. There was nobody outside the gate. We looked around the entrance area, thinking perhaps she had walked away while we were gone. There was nowhere obvious for her to have disappeared to, but we still checked. Eventually, we decided to look at the security footage from the entrance. That was when the whole thing became much harder to explain. The cameras clearly showed the office manager and me standing at the gate and talking. They recorded us going down there and standing outside the entrance. But on the other side of the gate, there was nobody. The footage showed the entire area where the woman should have been standing, yet she simply wasn't there. The cemetery manager thought we were trying to trick him. I couldn't really blame him for being skeptical because what we were telling him didn't make much sense. But I knew what I had seen. The office manager knew too. We had both been standing there looking directly at the same woman. There were multiple cameras covering the entrance, and not one of them recorded anyone standing on the other side. You could see us clearly, but the woman wasn't there at all. To this day, I don't know what we saw. Maybe there was some explanation we never discovered, or maybe she really was something we couldn't explain. The office manager and I eventually decided not to tell anyone else about it. We simply kept the experience between ourselves, occasionally bringing it up years later, when one of us remembered that strange Friday afternoon. Some friends and I used to spend time after school in the cemetery across from my high school. My girlfriend and I also walked through it whenever I took her home, so we became very familiar with the grounds. We spent a lot of time there, usually just talking, hanging out, or doing the kind of harmless things teenagers do when they have somewhere quiet to go. The cemetery never seemed especially threatening to us. In all the time we spent there, only 2 incidents ever stood out as genuinely strange. The first involved a bench-shaped family marker, which I believe had the name Acker on it. Smaller individual markers surrounded it, and we often sat on the stone or in the grass nearby. We generally tried to be respectful. When we wanted to throw a football around or mess around, we stayed on the road in front of the markers rather than walking over the graves themselves. Directly across the road from that marker was a mausoleum. One afternoon, I was sitting with my back toward its door while my friends tossed a shoe around like it was a football. It was one of those completely ordinary afternoons where nobody was expecting anything unusual. Then, without warning, something began banging from inside the mausoleum. The noise was loud enough to make the door vibrate. What made it stranger was that it didn't sound like someone simply hitting the door itself. The sound seemed to be coming from somewhere inside, behind it. We stopped what we were doing and listened. For a moment, it felt like everyone was waiting to see whether the noise would happen again. Then it stopped. Nothing else followed. I never heard anything like that happen there again, and we never figured out what could have caused it. Because it happened only once, it eventually became one of those strange memories that never received an explanation. The second incident involved the girl I dated throughout high school. She practiced witchcraft and was particularly interested in the type associated with Silver Raven Wolf and Scott Cunningham. At one point, after reading through another book, she became determined to convince me that I should perform a spell to discover my totem. I wasn't especially interested, but she kept bringing it up. One day in early fall, we were walking through the same cemetery while talking about it. At some point, I suddenly noticed something unusual around us. Every tree nearby seemed to be filled with crows. Not just 1 or 2, but enough that the branches looked occupied everywhere I looked. The cemetery was otherwise quiet. The only sound we could really hear was the soft croaking of the birds as they sat in the trees. I looked around at all of them and joked that I didn't need to discover a totem, because it looked like my totem had already found me. That was basically the end of the conversation. Crows were common in that cemetery, so I knew the timing didn't necessarily mean anything. Still, seeing so many of them at exactly that moment was an amusing coincidence, and more importantly, it saved me from any further pressure to participate in a totem ritual.